I'm Scott Lucas. This is World Unfiltered. Every generation probably has its political upheavals. But in the 21st century, it seems that the upheavals come at us in waves. Is it because the politics is different? Is it because social media accelerates everything? Whatever the reason, we are told on a day-to-day basis, only 30 years after we supposedly had an end of history and the victory of liberal democracy, that there's a rise of authoritarianism, or there's a rise of the far right, that there's a decimation of civil society. How exactly do we begin to navigate this, not only generally, but in our own local backyards, regarding, at the end of the day, the legitimacy and authority of government in our communities? Well, I need some help here. So I'm turning to Professor Cas Mudde. Cas Mudde is Professor of International Affairs at the University of Georgia, but he's had posts throughout Europe and the United States, including in Hungary, UK, and Belgium, visiting posts at a series of institutions. His range of publications, bringing and negotiating that idea of politics and civil society, range from a study of the Israeli settler movement to a comprehensive book on the far right, including the far right in the United States, and to look at the failure of the populist promise in Greece. He's a columnist for The Guardian in the UK, and he's the creator and host of the excellent podcast Radical, which, if I understand it correctly, is a radical look not only at politics, but at sports, music, and other areas of culture. Professor Mudde, welcome to World Unfiltered.
Thanks for having me.
Now, normally, I start by just diving into the topic, although I'll preface this by saying I will not burden you to define populism at all during this interview today.
Thank you.
However, I'm going to start a bit differently today because I learned this from a podcast I've been listening to quite recently, where the host asked his guest, well, here's the first question. Professor Cas Mudde, what's your favorite sports team?
PSV Eindhoven. Thank you. Thank you for asking me this.
There you go. Okay, so proper football as opposed to American soccer ball, which is, and hopefully the wonders of communications being that from Georgia, where you are now, you can still follow them.
Yes, I can.
I thought you might be able to. All right, and you know the trend that's going to follow here. What's your favorite political movie?
I guess A Clockwork Orange. Not only because it's like there is something with the skinhead movement, but it's just an amazing movie and an amazing book.
Absolutely. I'm not sure my kids, I keep trying to tell them there were movies back then they should be watching, but we'll see. And finally, well, look, every day when I go on social media, I've got a song for the day. What's your favorite political song?
Oh, that is so difficult. I'm actually going to go today with a song that I just heard on the radio, which oddly enough has not been very popular here in the US, but was very popular in the Netherlands, at least when I grew up. It's Paul Hardcastle, and the song is called 19, which is about the Vietnam War. And it's just an absolutely amazing song. And it actually is very informative, and yet also a hit.
Absolutely. Well, there you go. That might date us a bit, but that's not a bad thing, I think, where we go from. Okay, I'm just going to start on a path. Let's see where it goes. Every day we get a chatter about the far right rising somewhere, but for me to be specific, are you perceiving a rise in what you would call far right movements in Europe or elsewhere amidst the coronavirus pandemic?
So let me break this down in terms of extra parliamentary movement. And so groups that are demonstrating in the streets, I think we have seen a growth. There's been increased mobilization of a broader far right with influences of QAnon here in the US that demonstrates mostly against COVID measures. In terms of the parliamentary far right, in terms of elections, we haven't seen too much difference. So overall in the polls, the far right is doing a little bit less well, but I would say overall they're even. of course, we'll have to see in the coming year or two whether that effect continues or not, or non-effect.
Is that because, and I know there's a bit of speculation here, is that because there is a limit in terms of what voters, what communities will accept in terms of far-right politics and messaging? Or are we seeing what we might call conservative governments and movements co-opt the far right? So in effect, we're getting harder right-wing policies just in the guise of more, I wouldn't say centrist, but let's say establishment right-wing governments.
Yeah, I think that plays a role to a certain extent. We also have to keep in mind that the last elections, as well as the last polls of 2016, 17, 18, came on the back of the so-called refugee crisis, which was the perfect storm for the far right because it had issues of identity, immigration, and security at the top of the political agenda, which always favors the far right, whether these issues are adopted by mainstream parties or not. What we've seen during the pandemic is that these issues have gone down. Right? Logically, we're now speaking primarily about public health, about the economy. On top of that, all parties pretty much have accepted that the borders had to be closed, which is generally the key point that the far right brings up. But like, how can you score with that if even the Greens accept that the borders have to be closed? So in part, it is simply that their issues are not as dominant as they were before. You could look at it in a different way as well. Given that we barely talk about these issues, it's remarkable that the far right hasn't fallen further. And that shows that the far right is adaptable. They don't need only immigration issue. At the moment, for example, various of these parties profit from opposition to COVID measures.
Okay, but is it fair to say that we now see, as it were, rather than a unified far right, we see ripples? I'm thinking of the Denmark case, for example, right now, where there is pressure on Syrian refugees to go back, which is coming from that government. We, of course, get our own ripples in the UK because of the special place, perhaps, we have post-Brexit regarding right-wing politics.
I think what this shows is what I explained in my book, The Far Right Today. It's the mainstreaming of far-right politics, not just the fact that far-right parties are increasingly accepted as coalition partners, but also that far-right frames and far-right policies are now adopted and propagated by mainstream parties, predominantly of the right. Think about Sebastian Kurz, the Austrian Prime Minister, or Mark Rutte, the Dutch Prime Minister, or of course Boris Johnson in the UK. But even on the left, and Denmark is a very painful example there with the Danish Social Democrats, who are even like more nativist in terms of like the Syrian refugees, for example, than many right-wing parties. And what that leads to is that the boundaries between mainstream right and radical right have become porous. So you see that in particular with the Republican Party here, but also with the Conservative Party in Britain. Like, is that a mainstream right party or is that a radical right party? By the standards of the 1980s, 1990s, there will be no doubt they would be radical right parties. By today's standards, like, we're a bit unsure because our mainstream has moved so far to the right.
Let me link that to an inversion then, which is, okay, if there is this question of what the right is, can the European left draw any lessons from Joe Biden's victory in the United States in terms of presenting an alternative message or alternative politics to this notion of the right? Or are Europe and the US just very distinctive political systems at this point that prevent those lessons?
Well, they're of course very different political systems. Like in the US, 1-2% make all the difference. In most European systems, it doesn't. But if there's one lesson to be taken, not necessarily only from the left, but I would say from all liberal Democrats, from Joe Biden, it is that you should do your own thing. One of the good things that Joe Biden does, and which he shares with Angela Merkel, is that he's pretty much not on social media. He isn't influenced by pundits and pollsters the whole time. He does his thing. He embraces the state openly. He argues that the state can only really overcome some of the key problems. He's willing to invest massively in it. And although he speaks about bipartisanship and trying to include the political opponent, he by and large goes with his own agenda and tries to deliver, right? And I think that is the way forward. Now, whether that works out in the US system is a different issue. Because of the system, it's different. But I'm sure that it will pay off in Europe because people want leadership in terms of crisis, and they want to see that someone does things that help. And I think Biden is showing that.
So at the end of the day, what so-called valence politics or competence in politics still matters, despite all the messaging that we have flying around.
Yeah, I think that this is one of the big problems of the way that politics has shifted and been professionalized, and neo-labor was a very good example in the Clinton administration, but to these days everything is. If you look at the type of teams that surround political leaders these days and party leaderships, it's very often it's people from marketing, it's pollsters and those kind of things, and they have a very narrow view of politics and a very fluid view of politics. But actually many people have ideologies. Maybe not in the same way as political theorists write about it, but they have core values, they have expectations, and they want their parties to deliver on those, and they want the parties to be consistent and open. And I think that political parties do well to return to that type of politics.
Since you're still in God's country, as I call it, Georgia, where my folks are from, I've got to ask you, and they're both Trumpist, will Trump's legacy overtake that message you've just talked about in terms of competence? Or I guess what I'm saying is, do you think there will be a Trump legacy 10, 20 years down the line, or will that fade?
Well, there will be a legacy for sure. I think it will be a negative legacy. I think that in the short run, clearly the Republican Party has fully embraced the Trumpian way, and will fight and die with it. Of course, the big problem is that the US has a very undemocratic system, which has been made even more undemocratic by all kind of voter suppression laws that are being pushed through, which means that a minority can win not just like the House and the Senate, but even the presidency. And there is a possibility that this happens. Which again, you can't generalize this to Europe because it's the system that creates that kind of success for Trump. Inevitably, though, this type of openly white supremacist strategy is not working because the country is too diverse. And I think in 20 years, we look back at Trump as the highly divisive person he was that led the Republican Party astray and into temporary marginalization, because that is inevitable. There's a whole group of young people growing up, socialized now with the Republican Party being against them, Hispanics, even Asian Americans, etc.
That would seem to imply that the Republican Party cannot continue as a Trumpist party. It would seem to imply that. If that's the case,
it cannot in a functioning democracy, but the US isn't a functioning democracy. Okay. Like you have an electoral college that gives the majority of the seats to a minority of the people. You have many states now which have such undemocratic laws, voting laws, where this type of minority politics that the Republican Party is actively involved in can pay off.
I mean, my friend and colleague Brian Klaas, who was a very prominent commentator on U.S., has spoken of this as the advent of authoritarianism in the United States. I mean, are we talking about authoritarianism, or is this just more a question of institutional legitimacy in terms of making things work on a day-to-day basis?
I see Trump as a catalyst rather than a cause. I don't think Trump changed the U.S. He by and large brought out like the bad parts of the US and embraced them and emboldened him. Um, is he authoritarian? Yes. I mean, clearly he doesn't believe in democracy. He has been pretty clear about it. The Republican Party has embraced that too, by minimizing, for example, the coup of January 6th and those kind of things. So I see that. Do I see it at the top level? Not really. I mean, despite all of the hype, Trump overall did not implement that many authoritarian policies. And most surprisingly, for example, he didn't use COVID to push through authoritarian measures, as many governments have done, including like democratic governments. And of course, he got caught. I mean, he said COVID doesn't exist or it's not big. And if you say that, then you can't repress everyone on the basis of COVID. But it shows, I think, more than anything, that Trump doesn't have a clear ideology. He has instincts which are clearly nativist authoritarianism and anti-establishment, but he didn't have a plan for what he would do when he came to power. Now, that is probably different when he comes back. Like, if he runs in 2024, he will be like Orban when he came back. Like, he will have a clear plan, and it will be fundamentally anti-democratic.
Do you think he'll run?
No.
Okay. Okay. I think he will. So I want to come back and we'll do this in 3 years, right? But that's the next one. Before we leave the US and go to other places, I wanted to ask you on the other side, which is a lot of the media like to frame the whole thing. When's the coming split in the Democratic Party between the Biden centrist and, the progressives? But I want to refer it, you talked about Biden's strength in terms of this notion of a very practical politics in terms of what works and being clear about the agenda. Do you see the so-called progressives in the Democratic Party working along with that? Say someone like an Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, that they will work on that basis of pragmatism in politics? Or do we have this risk that the media tends to whip up, which is the ideologues versus the pragmatists as this proceeds over the next year or two?
I think there are ideologues who just don't compromise on anything. They mostly live on Twitter, though. And this has always been the case. Like Sanders, for example, is a much more pragmatic politician than his followers on Twitter. AOC is as well, to the big chagrin of many of the progressives, like on social media. At the moment, they work with him, but they work critically with him, and I think that's the right way. Like, not everything that Biden does is particularly progressive. I think overall he has done far better than I had expected. But at the same time, he doesn't take risks. I mean, on Israel, he has been very disappointing, and they will point that out. Right? But they work with him. And I think that pays off. Now, again, the American system works in a way that once they have to get reelected, they have to, people like AOC and other progressives have to cater to a very small subset of the population, namely very left-wing people in a very small part of New York City or something else. And they will do their thing, right? But I think so far, the left within the Democratic Party has been pretty constructive.
I wanted to ask you a question, flip back to Europe, but specifically the Netherlands. And forgive this as a bit of a sort of naive question, but here in the UK, it's like, we look at the Netherlands and it's the bastion of it's the bastion of liberalism, the left. What are they getting up to in the streets over there, right? Over there. Yet the Netherlands has not just one populist party, it's got arguably 2-3 populist parties in a way. In other words, there's this, how do we explain this Dutch society where you've had this space, as it were, for liberal or left ideas, but then also a very strong movement on what you might call the far right, or at least the populist right, over the past 15, 20 years?
Yeah, to be honest, I think very few people still see the Netherlands as a particularly left-wing country. But so I think it has a little bit to do with the fact that we perhaps misunderstood the progressiveness of the Dutch before, in the 20th century. So the Netherlands was always progressive, but in a social-cultural way, not necessarily socio-economic. and with regard to certain groups. Now, in the Netherlands has been one of the key examples of where the shift from socioeconomic to sociocultural politics was the most fundamental, and where we got into this kind of culture war thing, where you got really a radicalization on the right on sociocultural issues. At that being said, most surveys show that the Dutch population hasn't become much more right-wing. Rather, the political elite has become much more right-wing and primarily focused on socio-cultural issues. And that has led to this radical move towards the right on issues of immigration, Islam, to some extent even European integration. But to a certain extent, they're almost as much out of touch with the population as the overly progressive elites of the 1980s, 1990s were. I'm not saying that the vast majority of Dutch are very open towards Muslims in particular. They're not, right? But they're not more Islamophobic than your average West European, and obviously much less than your average East European. For some reason, they have captured, and I think this is the whole cultural elite, including journalists, they have convinced themselves that the Fortuyn voter, the voter of the right-wing populist Pim Fortuyn of the early 2000s, that is the Dutch voter, that is the Dutch person, and they cater to him. And perhaps the pandemic is bringing that a bit to an end. Now, we have at the moment 4 different radical right populist parties in the parliament. 3 got directly elected, 1 split office. This is remarkable, but it's also kind of common for such an open proportional system. Israel, for example, has a similar kind.
So we're actually, I'll hold off a question on civil society till the end, but I'm going to keep that Dutch example in my mind for that. I wanted to pick up on something else you've recently written or talked about. You've called for a very strong response to what is happening in Belarus, which is something that we covered here. The Lukashenko crackdown on civil society, crackdown on dissent, which has been going on for years, in fact, arguably decades, not just recently. Yeah. What is the response? What is the political strategy or tactics we adopt in responding, say, to a situation like Belarus and just in general to authoritarianism?
Now, overall, Europe as the EU, as well as most European countries, have been incredibly ambivalent towards authoritarian regimes, particularly those with resources, right? I mean, going from China to Saudi Arabia to, of course, Russia. Germany is the best example in this, like by having very close ties to the Putin regime on the gas line, for example. The Dutch are always investing in Russia and China, and then murmur something in the margins about human rights. There's always been the case. I think one of the things that makes it so painful on Belarus is that Belarus doesn't offer us anything. Right? I mean, there's some argument to be made, like that you don't want to pay too much of an economic price for human rights. It's problematic, but there's an argument there. Belarus doesn't cost you anything. Like, they don't create anything. There's no particular use to you. The other argument is, well, we can't be too critical because then they go to Russia. They are already like a pawn of Russia. So there's nothing at stake here. If you can't even stand up fully to Belarus, how can we expect you to stand up to Russia or China or Saudi Arabia? So I think it is important to stand up to Belarus. It is an atrocious situation. It is an atrocious situation at your border, right? This is not North Korea. This is our border. And if this regime profits in any way, shape, or form from the EU, then that should be cut.
But that leads me to something else, which you've written at the same time or recently, which is that it's high time for Europe to grow up. High time to grow up and to be independent of the United States. Now, I might agree with that sentiment, but can Europe be independent and grow up when it shows a relative, you called it ambivalence or ambiguity, I would call it a weakness on an issue like Belarus?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think they can, they don't want to, right? And
Okay.
and this is my point. Now, I know that I have a lot of friends and people who like my analysis who are transatlanticists. I'm not. While living in a European living in the US, I'm very critical about the US as an international actor. I don't think the EU should be dependent upon the US. It made sense during the Cold War. I don't think it makes sense anymore. We have seen over various former presidents that the US does things very different than the EU wants to do. I mean, George W. Bush, Trump. And what is important is that many Europeans think, yeah, but that's the Republican Party. But actually, the Democrats, like, they're like us. Maybe, but they're not interested in us. Like, under Obama already, the US has moved its focus away from Europe. It's now fighting for dominance in the Pacific against China. And so they're moving away. And it is time that Europe gets itself ready to play a serious role itself. It cannot all the time depend on the military power of the US. And then criticize the US for using that military power in different ways, because that's their right, right? I'm not a big fan of a big European army. I'm not a fan of big armies in general, but I want the EU to create that own power for it, because if not, they're going to be pretty much just a vassal of the US, and the US has now interests that are not necessarily European interests, particularly in its fight with China. Its fight with China is a fight over political dominance, hegemony in the world. That's not the EU struggle with China. So we need to become independent in that way. It doesn't mean we need to be anti-US. In most struggles, probably the US will be closer to us than Russia or China or any other country. But we can't just be pretty much a little mini-me of the US and act as if we have power.
Throughout our conversation, I've had the sense, whether we've talked about the United States, whether we talked about Netherlands, that a lot of what the headlines are about are what the elites are doing, or the elites are framing the socio-cultural conversation, as you put it. Do you have hope for civil society? Do you have hope that civil society can actually create that social and cultural space that you would prefer to the one that the elites are setting up at this point?
Yeah, but let me be clear. I've done a little bit of work on civil society a while back, and particularly in light of post-communism. There was this big kind of mythical discussion about civil society, which had brought down communist regimes, and because the people were yearning liberal democracy. I mean, that never happened. It just never happened. Most of this struggle of civil society in the post-communist space and the communist space was actually at least as much illiberal nationalist as it was liberal democratic. Civil society has always been relatively weak in most countries that have a well-developed state. And that makes sense. I mean, we think about civil society as being very vibrant and strong here in the US, but one of the reasons is because the state is so weak. I mean, they perform many functions that the welfare state performs in Western Europe. And I also believe they should. I do see active civil society in various ways, in some negative ways, unfortunately. Strong civil society against the asylum seekers in 2015, which directly was taken up by the political elite. But we also have a pretty strong civil society for serious action on climate change, which is not taken up by the political elite, right? But at the same time, it's still ongoing. There's civil society in other forms, LGBTQ rights, for example, Black Lives Matter. I mean, boomers always complained about this generation of doing nothing or tweeting, but actually, if you're honest, they've been pretty active. If I look at my students, for example, many are very involved with the environment. Many feel strongly about racial equality and those kind of things. And so I do see I do see an active civil society, but in the end, real change, particularly within democratic systems, comes from political parties. And this is one thing that I find problematic. There is this kind of idea about, well, either civil society or parties. I think you should do both. At least you should vote.
All right. One final question. You've named your podcast Radical. What does radical mean for you on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually kind of funny because I define in my academic work radical as kind of anti-liberal democratic, whereas I'm very much a liberal Democrat. I mean, to me, I guess when I talk about radical in that way, in the podcast way, it's more pushing boundaries. So, like, I'm a contrarian. So if everyone shifts right, I shift left, and if everyone shifts left, I shift right. But I think we should ask questions, and we should force people with power to explain their positions. And I think we haven't been doing that for the last decades. And I don't necessarily want to change everything. I mean, you're a skeptic, but I'm okay with the EU. But if I have the EU, I want to be told and explained why this is better than the alternative, what this does well, and why we should elaborate on it or not.
Professor Mudde, thank you for pushing boundaries. I'm not quite sure where we're going to wind up, so I'm wondering if you might rejoin us at a later point to see how far we've created something positive out of this. But I've thoroughly enjoyed this. Let me thank the viewers of World Unfiltered. Let me thank the good folks at Deep Dive Politics for putting us on the air today. Remember that you can find us on Facebook at Deep Dive Politics, on Twitter at dive_politics, and that if you prefer, you can listen rather than watch all of our World Unfiltered videocast on Spotify. For now, however, stay safe, stay sane, be decent to each other. I'm Scott Lucas, and this has been World Unfiltered.